when we step into the depths of the unconscious, it is not light that greets us first, but darkness. Many dream of old, dusty rooms where doors are locked or sealed shut. I have heard countless such dreams, and perhaps you have dreamt them too. In those dreams, a Buddha box appears, simple, unnamed, sometimes hidden behind a curtain or lying quietly under the bed of your childhood. What slumbers within it? Dear friend, let me say this gently. That box is you. Not the you of the present, rational, functional, or the social mask you've learned to wear, but the vibrant, fragile, unformed part of your being, a self that once knew how to cry when sad, laugh when joyful, and long to be seen as it truly is. Without conditions, imagine bending down and lifting the box's lid just a crack. Inside sits a child, not a random image, but a sacred archetype. It says nothing. Its eyes meet yours as if asking, have you forgotten me? There is no reproach, only a question. And behind that question lies a sky of memories, unspoken wounds, moments when you learned to stay silent, to be loved. The wooden box, when looked at closely, is a symbolic coffin, but the child within is not dead, it is merely asleep, sealed away by society's rules and the fear of rejection. Its pain is the nameless, formless ache of abandonment, often masked by achievements, busyness, or forced laughter. Do you dare meet that child's gaze, not with reason, but with a heart brave enough to break? For as long as you fear your own fragility, you will never truly live. The child waits within the wooden box, in dreams, in the silence between two breaths. It doesn't need you to rescue it. It only needs you to remember. It was once you, and to truly be yourself, you cannot abandon it any longer. Something strange happens as we grow up. We don't recall the exact moment we lost that child. There is no anniversary, no grave, no farewell. It happens in a dry, silent way, like an unnamed afternoon when the light fades. And you no longer hear your own laughter. The sacred child, as I wrote in Aion, is an archetype, but not a gentle one. On the contrary, it is disruptive, challenging, and often buried by social systems or the personal unconscious. Why? Because it embodies the potential for rebirth, a potential the adult ego often finds threatening. We fear it because it represents the unknown, something wild, intangible, uncontrollable. Have you ever seen that child's gaze, not in a dream, but in the real eyes of someone in life, an adult, sitting in a crowd, smiling politely, but with eyes so empty? They are terrifying. That is not just depression, it is the child within them, stripped of its voice. I once had a patient, a man in his 40s, successful and rational. In a recurring dream, he stood on a train platform, watching a train leave a boy behind. The boy did not cry. He simply stood there, barefoot, trembling on the cold ground, and the man could not turn back. I don't know why I didn't go back to him. He told me, his voice thick with panic. I smiled gently, for I knew he was on the verge of rebirth. When the child within us is left behind too long, it does not as many believe, it transforms. It becomes a silent cry, haunting us through inexplicable panic, exhaustion after success, or emptiness amidst loved ones. It finds its way back through dreams, art, or sometimes spiritual crises. I wrote in the Red Book, those who have not been a child will never give birth to themselves. We cannot individuate without sitting down and listening to that child's whisper, not with reason, but with the courage to bear emotion. Its presence wounds the ego, but that wound is the gateway to light. The archetype of the child, the sacred child, is part of the greater self, not its opposite. It carries the memory of the future. It reminds us that before we were a doctor, a parent, a solar, or an enlightened soul, we were a trembling being, needing to be touched by a loving gaze. You've asked, why do I feel lost? Even when I've succeeded, why does sadness come without reason? I answer, as a friend sitting beside you in a silent forest, because that child has never been held. It still stands there in a foggy train station between dream and reality, waiting for you to turn back, to meet it again. You don't need time. You only need to pause, and listen. The sacred child, though innocent and full of primal light, is not always welcomed in the castle of adult consciousness. On the contrary, it is often the first to be exiled. Imagine a brightly lit room where the ego resides with logic, function, and responsibility. One day, the child knocks. It carries no title. It speaks no rational language. It brings only feeling messy, intense, unexplained, and so the ego shuts the door. Thus begins what I call the archetypal dissociation, where rejected parts of the self do not vanish but slip into the unconscious, becoming silent specters that manipulate the soul's life. The sacred child in that darkness does not it transforms. It may become the eternal victim, the inner rebel, or the forgotten one in dreams. It lives as an obsession, a wordless question, an unexplained emotion, a sense of being lost among loved ones. A student of mine once dreamt of an abandoned wooden house in a forest, cold and desolate. Inside was an empty cradle. She didn't know why she had to go there, but she felt that leaving would mean losing something vital forever. I explained the house was her soul, and the cradle was where her child was left behind. Why is the cradle empty? She asked. I didn't answer. I told her to write a letter to that child, one she didn't need to send. Weeks later, the dream changed. The cradle was no longer empty. In it was a cloth door, its mouth sewn shut, but its eyes open. That symbol chilled me. It was as if the unconscious itself whispered, I'm still here. Even if you no longer hear me speak, I see you low. We think we've outgrown childhood emotions, but in truth, we've only built psychological walls around that child, calling it the past. Then, when we're exhausted, when ideals collapse, when marriages crack, or when we simply no longer feel like ourselves, that knock returns. The sacred child, as I analyzed in the archetypes and the collective unconscious, is not a childish figure, but a spiritual image of healing and renewal. To reach it, the ego must cross the threshold of refusal, not refusing others, but refusing its own primal self. And the paradox is this: the child never blames us. It holds no grudge. It simply waits in dreams, in music, in a fleeting glance at an old photo. It is the most patient part of the soul, the part that never learned to close the door, in a dream of my own. Recorded in the Red Book, I entered a small cave. On its walls were prehistoric drawings, children's hands pressed into the earth. I touched one and suddenly heard a faint laugh, as if the self I'd forgotten was once so innocent. The threshold of refusal is not the end. It is where you pause not to turn back, but to understand why you walked away. In alchemy, this is Nigredo, the darkness, the dissolution of old material, preparing for rebirth. The sacred child, when refused, does not lose its sanctity. On the contrary, its pain illuminates its potential for resurrection. Without darkness, there is no gold. So, if you feel confused, lost, or find everything meaningless, despite outward stability, know that you stand at that threshold. And what you feel is not a flaw, it is an invitation. Listen, return to the locked room in your dream and ask, are you still there? There is a moment in the inner life fragile as smoke, fleeting as dawn when we look back at the forgotten child, not with rational eyes, but with the gaze of a soul newly awakened from a long sleep. This is not an act of thought, it is witnessing. I recall a patient who sat silently in my office for a long time after a series of dreams about a locked room and a wordless child. Then one day, he said only this, I don't know why, but I feel sorry for it. I knew, in that moment, the process had begun, not healing in the modern sense, but the turning of the self, looking for the first time into the cracks of its own mirror, and instead of fear, he felt compassion. The symbol of witnessing is not about solving or controlling. It's like lighting a candle in a dark cellar. The darkness remains, but that small light changes everything. In alchemy, this marks the end of Nigredo, when darkness yields to purification. A pristine light, untouched by expectations or belief systems. The sacred child, as I described in my Zurich lectures, is the archetype of the unborn healer. It carries the seed of new life, but because it is young, it cannot nurture itself. It needs an adult ego brave enough to become its caretaker. But to care, you must first see. This seeing does not come easily. It doesn't come through books or psychological knowledge. It often comes through crisis, a loss, an emptiness, a familiar face, in a dream, an old song that makes you weep without reason. I call this the call from the collective unconscious, where buried parts of personal history speak through symbols. A woman once told me that after her mother's death, she began painting again, something she loved as a child, but abandoned when scolded, that drawing won't get you anywhere. She didn't intend to heal or grow. She only felt that if she didn't paint, she would fade. With each brushstroke, the sacred child re-emerged, not as a fictional figure, but as a vibrant, warm, pristine wave of emotion. She didn't need to name it. She only needed to stop turning away. That is the entire secret. The ego doesn't need to rescue the child. It only needs to be present. Like a mother who cannot understand her child's language, but holds them close and hums from the heart. This is where true individuation begins, not as analysis, but as communion. You no longer treat the wound, you converse with it. You no longer try to escape the past, you invite it back to the table. The sacred child doesn't ask you to become a child again. It invites you to bring its sanctity into the present. That is unjudged creativity, fearless curiosity, vulnerability without armor. If you've ever felt withered, disconnected, or meaningless, it may be the child whispering to you. In one of my own dreams, I stood before a frozen lake. Beneath the clear ice was a glowing creature, small, curled, asleep. I knelt and placed my hand on the ice. Nothing happened, but in my heart there was a faint crack like ice beginning to break. I understood. Life begins when you stop trying to shatter the ice and start touching it with kindness. We are taught that only what is efficient, rational, and strong has value. But the sacred child teaches the opposite, that what is fragile, incomplete, and unnamed is where life begins. It is the symbol of the microcosm within the macrocosm, where redemption comes not from power, but from an unguarded gaze. You may ask, how do I know I've begun to see it? I have no definition, but you will know. When you pause in a busy day and feel your heart still at a falling leaf, when you're driving and a childhood memory surges like a wave, when you look in the mirror and see a distant gaze, as if someone is looking at you from within, that is the child. It does not blame, it only asks, can you see me now? When an adult soul is ready to see the sacred child within, not with rational eyes, but with a loving gaze, something strange begins to happen. The child speaks, not in clear words, as adults expect, not in philosophical discourse or psychological terms, but in symbols, in emotions, in fleeting dream images, in a note of music that brings tears without reason, in the heartbeat echoing from the depths. I once wrote, anything denied in consciousness returns as fate. The sacred child, if unheard, becomes fate, often as recurring wounds, relationships that leave us feeling abandoned, unseen, or not enough, cycles of self-sabotage just as success dawns, an insatiable thirst for love. All are cries from the child within, not to be healed, but to be heard. Listening is a ritual act. It requires an ego still enough to bear imperfection, soft enough to be undefended, patient enough not to interrupt. When I sit with patients, I don't decode them. I listen. I listen to the wordless voice, the child within them, whispering in the silences. In one session, a man recounted a dream where he found a small, injured bird in his hands. I wanted to bandage it, he said, but my hands trembled, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't interpret. I only asked, did the bird look at you? He paused for a long time, then nodded. He looked at me, not blaming, just said. I said, that's when it begins. Oh, people think working with the inner child is a technique. To me, it is a relationship, a true relationship, meaning no control, no idealization, no judgment. You don't come to heal the child, you come to live with it. And the first thing every child needs is not advice, but to be heard. When the sacred child is heard, it begins to revive symbols. It carries images, never spoken yet vivid, as the first light after a long night. A woman trapped in depression and self-blame for being useless began dreaming of an abandoned garden with a broken swing after a series of analyses. Each dream, the swing gained another rope, and one time she dreamt of sitting on it for the first time. I don't know why. She said, but I felt peace. Doppler, we are in a realm where analytical language falls short. Here, only symbols speak. The garden is the forgotten soul. The swing is an unfinished childhood memory. Each rope is a step of contact between the adult ego and the sacred child. And the moment she sat on it was the meeting of linear time and eternity, of the present and the wound. I don't ask you to believe this. I only invite you to try. When a childhood memory surges, pause. Don't rush to analyze it. Listen to it as you would the wind through a forest, not to understand, but to be present when a too sensitive emotion arises. Instead of dismissing it, ask, what do you want to say? That is the first step of an inner ritual where the sacred child begins to rewrite your life's myth. We live in a culture that dismisses emotion, worships reason, and defines maturity as needing no one. But I, in my final years, said that the entire process of individuation leads to one thing: becoming like a child, but with consciousness. Not childishness, but the sacred child, the archetype of rebirth, of restored meaning. When you begin to dialogue with the child, something new happens. Old wounds cease to be burdens, they become symbols. Pain is no longer failure, but a doorway. Emptiness is no longer a flaw, but a space for sacred presence. You don't become more perfect, you become more whole. And the strangest thing, when you listen to the child within, the outer world changes too. Relationships soften, work takes on a creative hue. Light becomes easier to see, not because the world changes, but because you stopped abandoning a part of your soul. In the deepest current of the soul, where day and night, reason and mystery blur, a silent ritual unfolds, where the ego is no longer the center of control, but a pilgrim. It comes not with power, but with trembling, not with knowledge, but with a small lamp flickering in the forest of symbols. This ritual doesn't happen in churches, meditation halls, or analytic institutes. It happens in a moment, perhaps in a rain of memories, when you sit still and a sob rises from your chest for no reason, or when you see a scribbled drawing in a childhood journal and something in you brushes against your heart. That is not just emotion. It is a ritual when the sacred child begins to speak faintly, but truly it demands a presence free of control. The child doesn't need explanations, it needs presence. The ego, accustomed to victory, analysis, and strategy, must learn the language of sanctified helplessness, the language of symbols, dreams, and things unspeakable yet real. I once shared a patient's dream where they entered an ancient house with a deep basement. In a small room below, they found a platinum-haired child asleep. When it opened its eyes, it said, "I've waited for you a long time." This was no random dream. It was a map of reconciliation. Each level of the house was a layer of consciousness. Each step down was a release of the ego. And the child was the sacred center that never left us. Reconciliation doesn't happen through reasoning. It happens when you stop doing the right thing and start listening to what's true. The child doesn't want you to succeed. It wants you to be present. It doesn't demand you grow up. It invites you to be honest. When you say, "I don't know what to do with this sadness," the child nods gently. "Finally, you're hearing me with your heart?" I've seen this in therapy. When a patient, after years of controlling emotions, sat silently and said, "I miss me." That simple sentence, like a breeze, was sacred. Not because it solved anything, but because it allowed something forgotten to be named. The sacred child, in that moment, ceased to be a specter in the unconscious halls and became a companion in awakened life. The ritual of reconciliation often comes with tears not of suffering, but of recognition, of realizing how far you've wandered, of seeing that the child still waits without anger or blame, only needing your presence, of understanding that the fragile, wounded, vulnerable part of you is your strongest part. For it is where unconditional love is born. In the Red Book, I wrote, "Love the child within you, for it holds your future." This is not poetic. It is alchemical, for only when the sacred child is integrated does the creative energy frozen in wounds become free. And that energy transforms your life not as a better copy of the past, but as a transmutation from unconscious element to symbolic gold. I've seen people seemingly broken find light through their inner child. A woman who loathed her body, dreamt she was a little girl, lost in a forest, finding a pond where she washed her face. Looking into the water, she didn't see herself but a newborn child smiling. She woke in tears, not from fear, but because she felt for the first time, I'm no longer trapped in ugliness. I am life. That we cannot reconcile with a child through will. We reconcile through softness. By sitting down, stepping away from life's battle lines, and listening to a whisper we've long called irrational, but that is the deepest reason for all pain and all hope. Reconciliation is abandoning the role of the perfect adult and becoming an honest caretaker. It is looking into the child's eyes and saying, I'm not here to control you. I'm here to learn to love again. When that happens, you don't just heal the child within you, heal the world around you. For relationships are no longer shaped by wounds, but by wholeness. After the ritual of reconciliation, after silent tears and an honest gaze inward, what happens next? Does the journey end in acceptance and peace, or is something deeper, quietly waiting like a seed under snow, awaiting spring to rise into light? This stage is not about healing. It is about living, not merely surviving biologically, but living as a source of creation, a stream that never stops flowing in your unconscious. And at the center of that stream is a sacred child. In ancient traditions, from Chinese Taoism to Greek mysticism, from Inca shamanic rites to Christian symbols, the sacred child appears as the embodiment of rebirth. In some myths, it is the Savior born in a manger, like Jesus. In others, it is the Creator, God, both innocent and all-knowing, like Horus. Though the images differ, the essence is one. Where the child appears, life begins anew, not as before, but wholly new. I wrote in Aion, the archetype of the sacred child is not just memory, but the future in the guise of the past. It is potential yet unlived. The child is not only a forgotten wound, it is also hidden talent, suppressed emotion, a dream you dared not voice every time you smile shyly. Wanting to dance? Every time you feel moved but hold back. Every time you sense something great within you but dismiss it as childish. That is the child calling. And now, after the long journey of reconciliation, You can hear that call clearer than ever. Picture this: a man over 50, a successful lawyer, always living within bounds. In a dream, he walked with a small child across a wide field, the child pulling him to a tent made of drawing paper. Inside, hundreds of watercolor paintings hung vibrant and wild. He woke in tears and began painting again, not for exhibitions, not to be an artist, but because something in him came alive again. That is the sacred child. When touched, it is no longer memory, but a source of creative energy. It doesn't ask, is there a good reason to sing, write, dance, play, love? It only asks, is this true? And if you answer yes, that is a rebirth. Understand this: creativity is not the artist's privilege. It is the soul's living function. As I emphasized, a healthy psyche dreams and creates symbols. Meaning, when you write an honest journal entry, you create. When you garden and notice the green of a leaf, you create. When you listen to your child without imposing, you live in symbols. The sacred child doesn't just want you to remember, it wants you to begin not on the old path, but your own. It might be learning the piano past 40, saying, I love you, with a trembling voice, choosing to forgive parents though scars remain, creating something new, not because the world needs it, but because your soul needs to breathe. I once spoke with a woman carrying the pain of parental abandonment. For years, she wore a shell of strength, but in a dream, she was a child building a city from wood scraps. Each time the wind blew, it fell, yet the girl rebuilt. When she woke, she wept not from despair, but from understanding. I never stopped trying. I've always created amidst collapse. And you see, the child doesn't wait for stability. It builds cities from scraps. It paints with fingers. It writes with tears. And from that sacred life begins no need for recognition, no need for results, only the need to live fully. I must emphasize, don't idealize the child as a gentle state. It is also rebellious, stubborn, erratic, and that is the sign of life. When you feel an urge, slightly wild, slightly odd, don't dismiss it. Ask, is this my child whispering? If you listen, you'll see those unusual acts are the gateway to the sacred. In alchemy, the final stage, rubido, is when the soul's light merges with matter. In other words, when spirit is not just understood but lived. And who leads you there? The sacred child, guiding you through all stages. Nigredo, darkness. Albedo, purification. Citrinitas, understanding. And finally, rubedo, creation. This stage doesn't urge you to do what's right. It asks, what have you not yet lived? It might be an unfinished dream, an unexpressed love, a song in your heart, an act of forgiveness, a path you dared not take. The sacred child invites you not to return but to move forward. Remember, you don't need to become an artist. You only need to be honest. For the sacred child doesn't seek perfection. It only needs you to be present and dare to live as yourself.